Favourites. Everybody has them, including your parents. So here's a list of my top 13 Doctors from the first Regeneration cycle. Now obviously this is just my opinion, and whilst coming up with this list, I changed my mind a couple of times regarding which order each incarnation should appear in. So let's start with number 13, David Tennant's Doctor. 2.0. Depending on your view, this is either the spare hand Doctor or the version of Tennant's Doctor which lasted from the beginning of Journey's End until the next regeneration sequence that was seen in the End of Time. So that's either 1 or 6 episodes for that particular incarnation. Granted, some other incarnations have had fewer episodes, but that was not through the choice of the showrunners. Whereas this was. And it happened at a time in the show's history when the Doctor was supposedly coming up to his final incarnation. And even though it was a brilliantly inventive way to trick the audience into thinking Tennant's time was up, it ultimately ended up being a waste of a regeneration. Number 12, John Hurt's Doctor. Considering what I said about Tennant 2.0, this is another case of a wasted regeneration. But he's higher on the list because the character was created out of necessity. With Eccleston not wanting to return, what other choice did Moffat have? True, he could have brought McGann back instead, but if you take away the bias most of us have for wanting to see the 8th Doctor return to our screens, ask yourself the following question. Can you really see McGann's Doctor being the one to seemingly destroy Gallifrey? To be honest, I can't. And let's face it, John Hurt was the perfect actor to play the secret Doctor who ended the Time War. Number 11, Peter Davison's Doctor. And it's at this point I feel I should remind everyone listening that this is my own personal choice, and if I'm honest, I've never found the 5th Doctor to be that interesting of a character. When I think of 5th Doctor stories, the first thing that comes to mind is the 5 Doctors. And if I'm thinking a particular Doctor's best episode is the one where he shares screen time with other Doctors, then something has gone horribly wrong. Number 10, Colin Baker's Doctor. I bet this is higher up than you thought it would be. Honestly, I think the 6th Doctor gets a bit of a bad rap. Okay, strangling his companion the first chance he got obviously didn't help. But overall, I think the 6th Doctor was a step up from the previous incarnation in virtually every single way. Apart from the costume. The 6th Doctor had more personality, and the relationships he had with both of his companions were more defined because the writers didn't have to juggle various relationships with multiple companions. And I think the Doctor, no matter which incarnation, is at his best when he has one solid companion relationship at a time, rather than when he's attached to a group of companions. Number 9, Matt Smith's Doctor. Now this is going to upset some people, but seriously, if you look back at Smith's era, do you know what you'll see? The Doctor being the psychic in a show called Doctor Who. Series 5 was mainly about Amy and Rory's relationship. Series 6 was about River Song and her past. The first half of Series 7 was building up to saying goodbye to Amy and Rory. The second half of Series 7 was about finding out the truth about Clara, which led to the reveal of a secret incarnation, whose story was the main focus of the 50th anniversary special. The only real episode which focused on the Doctor as a character was The Time of the Doctor, and that's only because he was about to die. And by that, I mean actually die. If only more of Matt Smith's episodes were focused on his Doctor, he may have ended up a little higher on the list. Number 8, Sylvester McCoy's Doctor. Okay, so the 7th Doctor got off to a bumpy start, but once he was paired with Ace, the show really turned a corner. Especially with the character of the Doctor as he became more sinister. He was obviously still on the side of good, but we never quite knew if what he was saying was the truth or a lie. It was a brilliant way to reinvent the character again after he had arguably become stale. The mystery was back, but sadly it didn't last for long as the show was cancelled, thus tarnishing McCoy's Doctor in the public's perception. However, I'm here to say no more. Number 7. Paul McGann's Doctor. You're probably thinking, hang on a minute, why is Paul McGann's Doctor so high up on the list compared to both the Tennant 2.0 and Jon Hurt's Doctors? Well, here's the thing. Unlike those two incarnations, Paul McGann's short time in the role was out of his hands. There was no way Jon Hurt was going to make a prequel series about the Time War, although that would have been awesome. And as I've previously stated, I believe Tennant 2.0 was a wasted regeneration. Also, in the short time McGann's Doctor graced our screens, he showed a vast array of emotions featuring confusion, happiness, anger, and compassion. And he did all of that with about 60 minutes of screen time. Just think what he might have achieved if he was given at least one full series. Number 6. William Hartnell's Doctor. If it wasn't for his portrayal, this list would not be possible. Granted, his Doctor was a miserable, cantankerous old man, but he also had a twinkle in his eye, thus making him a lovable rogue with a heart of gold. He only showed his true emotions when it was warranted, and that made him such an interesting character to watch. Naturally, being the first Doctor, Hartnell's era had several key elements which would be repeated countless times throughout the show's history, such as the reluctant companion and several returning species, to name a few. The Hartnell era also had something which hasn't really featured since. Several historical stories which did not feature an alien presence. And that is something I would like to see return once in a while. Number 5. Patrick Troughton's Doctor. So we go from the man who started the legacy to the man who continued it. Patrick Troughton probably had the hardest task within the show's history. He was the first ever Next Doctor. If his incarnation didn't connect with the audience, the show would have been in serious trouble and it probably wouldn't still be around today. Unfortunately though, most of Troughton's episodes are no more. However, we are lucky to have the second Doctor return on 3 separate occasions long after his initial run. And when he did come back for a multi-Doctor story, he was one of, if not the highlight of the whole episode. His banter with the third Doctor is a joy to watch, and it hasn't been replicated since. Maybe Troughton's Doctor would be higher on this list if it were possible to watch all of his episodes that are currently lost in the chasm of time. Number 4. Tom Baker's Doctor. In my opinion, this incarnation was the most alien of them all. He's just bizarre, and that's why we love him. One moment he was like the one crazy relative we all have, then he could become slightly sinister, much like some other relatives we all have. But what is Doctor Who without memorable companions? Well, it's kind of tedious. However, the Tom Baker era was anything but, as it contained some of the best known companions of any era. There's also the long list of top moments such as the return of the Cybermen, the expansion of Time Lord history, a farewell to the show's best known companion, the return of an old frenemy, twice, the saddest goodbye of a companion since Susan, the first Gallifreyan companion since Susan, who then actually regenerated, and let's not forget one of the greatest stories in Who history. But if this particular era is so good, why has Tom Baker's Doctor finished relatively low on the list? Well, I'm sorry to say, some of his serials are rather forgettable. But that's not his fault, because even in the worst of his stories, he is still the best thing about them. Number 3. David Tennant's Doctor 1.0. My first Doctor isn't actually number 1, so you can't accuse me of being biased. There's a lot to love about David Tennant's portrayal of the Doctor, and I'm sure no one watching this video would disagree. He's an absolute joy to watch, so why isn't he higher on my list? Well, if you were to take a step back and look at each of Tennant's series, you'll come to realise that a lot of his episodes can be skipped and it wouldn't affect any of his series-long story arcs. Especially in David Tennant's first series as the Doctor. The Idiot's Lantern, The Impossible Planet, The Satan Pit, Love and Monsters, and Fear Her seem to be filler episodes with no real consequences. And no matter how great an actor does in the role, if the stories aren't up to scratch, your character won't reach its full potential. Just ask Colin Baker. Could you imagine if Tennant's Doctor was given some meatier stories to sink his teeth into? Each one having some significance to a future episode or being connected to the overall theme of a series. Number 2. Christopher Eccleston's Doctor. Eccleston's Doctor had the benefit of being the first Doctor in the rebooted series. This meant a lot more behind the scenes planning could have happened, thus making the whole series more enjoyable. Think about it. Just how long had Russell T Davies wanted to bring back Doctor Who? For all we know, it could have been years. That's years of tinkering away until things were as good as they were ever going to be. Whereas each follow-up series didn't have the luxury of extra time to spend on the planning stages, so some episodes feel a bit of a letdown. And for me, that's what makes Eccleston's series special. You can't skip an episode because every one of them is connected to other events that occur during this series or in a later series. But what about the man himself? Eccleston's Doctor, from a storyline perspective, is the most complex. Living with the regret of what his past incarnation had previously done, he is filled with anger and sorrow, yet it's not depressing to watch. He pushes his own feelings aside and carries on as if nothing has happened. This makes him the most human Doctor of them all, which in turn makes him the most relatable. And if a character can connect with an audience that strongly, he or she will live forever. And number 1, Jon Pertwee's Doctor. Well, it had to be. He was the only incarnation left. And what an incarnation, as the show was reinvented a number of times during Pertwee's run. First, his Doctor was stuck on Earth after being exiled by the Time Lords. Then he could only leave Earth when the Time Lords needed him to do some jobs for them. And finally, after a battle against Omega, the Doctor was given back the ability to operate the TARDIS, thus making Pertwee's run come full circle. Pertwee's era also introduced us to two of the most memorable companions during the show's history. It also expanded on the concept of unit by fleshing out the characters of the Brigadier and Sergeant Benton. We also get to meet several classic villains for the first time, such as the Nestene, the Autons, the Silurians, the Sontarans, and of course, the Master. I personally feel Pertwee's era is the best overall, as it takes what was great with an already established product and expands on it with its own stories without contradicting what came before. Take note, Mr. Moffat. So after listening to me prattling on like a deranged madman, just how wrong am I? Luckily, there's a comment section you can use where you can disregard my opinions and claim that yours are superior. So why not leave a message below listing out your favourite Doctors? And if you haven't already, why not subscribe?